If you care about history the way I do, you already know that survival knowledge is never just about the past. Before we go any further, subscribe to this channel and share it with someone who values real historical insight, because what we're talking about today isn't nostalgia. It's hard-earned knowledge that kept families alive when there were no safety nets, no refrigeration guarantees, and no second chances. During the Great Depression, expiration dates were irrelevant. What mattered was understanding food, respecting its limits, and knowing how to stretch those limits safely. That mindset is exactly what we're recovering here. And by the end of this guide, you'll see why these techniques still outperform modern convenience thinking. Why expiration dates didn't matter when survival was on the line. In Depression-era households, printed expiration dates were rare, and trust in manufacturers was even rarer. Food was judged by smell, texture, taste and experience passed down through generations. People understood that best by was not the same as unsafe, and they built preservation systems around that reality. Flour was sifted to remove weevils and baked anyway. Milk was boiled and resoured into clabber for baking. Meat was inspected visually and by touch before being salted or cooked thoroughly. The practical lesson here is simple and uncomfortable for modern viewers. Food safety was an active skill, not a label you obeyed blindly. You can apply this today by learning how your pantry items actually fail over time, rather than discarding them at the first printed warning. How root cellaring extended shelf life without electricity. Root cellars were not primitive refrigerators. They were controlled environments designed to slow decay using stable temperature, darkness and airflow. Potatoes, carrots, beets, apples and onions were stored separately because people knew ethylene gas from fruit could rot vegetables faster. Sand or sawdust was layered between produce to prevent moisture buildup and physical contact. If you live in an apartment today, you can still replicate this principle by using insulated containers in cool closets, separating produce types and rotating stock weekly. The Depression-era lesson is that shelf life is controlled more by environment than packaging. And once you understand that, expiration dates lose much of their power. Why drying food was a long-term insurance policy. Drying was one of the most reliable preservation methods because it removed the one thing spoilage organisms need most: water. Families dried apples, peaches, beans, corn, and even greens on racks near wood stoves or outdoors in screened frames. Meat was sliced thin and air-dried into jerky long before it ever saw salt. The key was patience and airflow, not heat. Today, you can apply this knowledge by air-drying herbs, fruits or mushrooms instead of freezing them, which preserves flavor and avoids power dependence. Depression-era families understood that properly dried food could last months or years if kept dry, making it a cornerstone of food security. So, let's talk about how salting and curing made meat usable far beyond its initial freshness. You see, back in the day, fresh meat was a luxury, not something anyone could just count on. Salting, brining, and curing, these methods allowed families to slaughter animals whenever they were available and then, consume the meat slowly over time rather than all at once. Pork, for example, was packed into salt barrels, soaked before cooking, and then boiled thoroughly to get rid of any excess salt. Fish was a bit different. It was split, salted and dried until it was honestly hard as wood. Now, these methods didn't get rid of bacteria entirely, but they did control it enough to make meat usable, as long as it was cooked properly. If you're thinking about a modern application, you might try curing your own bacon or salt-preserving fish. Learning, really, how salt concentration and time work together, instead of just relying on a fridge. This kind of knowledge, well, it turns meat from a short-term asset into a long-term one. Right, so let's talk about how fermentation quietly saved lives. Fermentation wasn't some trendy thing, you know. It was survival chemistry. Sauerkraut, sour pickles, clabber milk, and fermented beans, well, they stretched nutrition through the winter, especially when fresh food was just nowhere to be found. These foods kept because beneficial bacteria, they outcompeted the harmful ones, creating acidic environments that really resisted spoilage. Families would monitor the smell and keep a careful eye on surface growth, skimming off harmless yeast and only tossing things out when rot was, well, obvious. Today, you can do the same by fermenting cabbage, cucumbers, or dairy at home, learning to trust your senses and the process itself, rather than being afraid of it. Depression-era fermenters didn't just guess, you know. They observed, adjusted, and passed that knowledge on. Now, why were leftovers managed, not just wasted? Nothing was ever thrown away casually. Cooked food got repurposed right away, because everyone knew the clock started ticking as soon as heat and moisture were introduced. Soups, for example, were reheated every day to boiling, just to reset bacterial growth. Bread? It was dried into crumbs or made into pudding before mould could get a foothold. Fats were strained and reused, right up until rancidity was, well, unmistakable. The takeaway for today is learning how things like reheating, acidity and dryness affect shelf life. Once you understand these factors, you can safely stretch your food use well beyond what most people do now, without risking your health. So, what does Depression-era preservation teach us now? The real lesson isn't about nostalgia or fear, it's about competence. Folks survived because they understood food as a living system, with rules you could actually learn. Expiration dates, well, they simplify that knowledge, but they also kind of replace it. By studying how things were preserved during the Depression, you reclaim responsibility for your food, your storage, and your own survival margin. It's not about rejecting modern safety, really. It's about exceeding it through understanding. If this guide added something real to your knowledge base, do consider subscribing to the channel. Share this with someone who respects history and keep this information alive. Survival knowledge only works if it's remembered and passed on.